Welcome to Longevity Industries' presentation of the Destiny of Manufacturing podcast. I am Dean Phillips and I am your host. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Precision Metal Forming Association and the PMA's Educational Foundation for all that they do for this show and for our industry. With me today, I have Danny Schaeffler, who is the President of Engineering Quality Solutions. Welcome, Danny.
Well, thank you, Dean. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. And so right away, what's your big takeaway here for the future and the destiny of manufacturing over the next 5 years?
Well, I think that's a much easier question to ask than it is to actually answer accurately. But I would say globalization is going to continue, and the manufacturing industry needs to be aware of it and prepared for it.
Now, when you say globalization, can you expand on that?
Well, yeah, I think globalization should affect every part of the manufacturing supply chain, from tool construction to tool build to even stamping of materials or acquisition of materials. It is going to wind up continue the trend of going to where the highest quality, lowest cost products or build is available.
Excellent. And I think that's pretty accurate, because I think that in general, we're already starting to look at that, but we need to realize it is a global economy, and we need to be prepared to compete on that level. And I think we already have seen some of that, but I think you're absolutely right. It seems to be continuing in that direction, and I think for the next 5 years we'll definitely continue that way.
Right, and I do agree that it has been going on, but I think it's going to accelerate also because there are many options available globally in terms of, for example, production sources. If a domestic company wants to compete on price, then absolutely, that is an option. But if the drive to lowest price is not what companies are targeting, they need to be able to provide some type of value-added product, either working with more complex materials or more complex part designs or some other type of reason to justify manufacturing not going elsewhere in the world.
Sure.
Otherwise, you're competing on price. Right. And some companies want to do that, which is a legitimate business decision.
Yeah, and one that you have to be able to back up that decision, though. I think you're right.
Yeah, that's true. And you probably need a whole lot of volume to stay in business if you are going to compete just on price. And if you want to not go that route, you're going to need to provide some type of value-added product or service, and that's going to mean you need to know what you're doing. And with that, I think you start hitting on one of my passions, and that has to do with training. And that's something that the primary sponsor of your podcast, PMA, does exceptionally well. They offer many different types of training throughout the year, throughout the country, to members and non-members alike. And that's the only way people will improve. Well, I guess there's two ways: trial and error, and that may not be the most cost-effective and time-effective approach, or some other type of training.
Right. So Danny, give us your background. Tell us how you got involved in manufacturing.
Well, the long story is that when I was young, my favorite television show was The $6 Million Man. And I was very much interested in the bionics of that, which got me interested in biomedical engineering, which is what my undergraduate degree started off as. But from there, went from biomedical engineering for implants to biomaterials to just materials engineering in general. And first job out of college was working for a very large steel company, and one of their main markets was the automotive industry. And I guess that was the first time I realized the magnitude of the industry. It's not just 3 or 4 different steel grades to choose from for the automotive industry, but at least now there are a couple of hundred different grades to choose from for any given part. And there are so many other metal forming applications outside of automotive. So I guess, as I mentioned earlier, one of my passions is training, and I guess it's all just fed through my experiences, seeing how many different options are available. And I was coming at the time working for a metal supplier and saw how many options were available. And I'm thinking, if you're a manufacturing company, you might be used to having, 3 or 4 different materials to choose from. And people on the manufacturing floor are really, really smart. And when they've got 3 or 4 different options, they can kind of figure out which one's going to be the best. But when they're faced with 200 different options, they need a little bit more education to narrow that down. So when unfortunately in 18 years ago, that steel company folded. And so over the past 18 years, I've had a consulting firm that does exactly what I've been talking about, not just the training, but the in-plant failure analysis. When a part is splitting, why is it splitting? Is it because of the material? Is it because of tooling issues, cutting clearances? What part of the process is not working out the way it should?
Right.
And so there's some hands-on analysis that can be done, and I always try to combine that with some training, because would want companies to improve. Sure. And there's so many hard problems to deal with. It's a shame when they have to deal with the easy problems.
Well, I think as the more educated you become, the more problems appear easier. But if you don't have that experience,
that's a good point.
It can seem almost overwhelming. And I've watched companies in the stamping industry and fabrication industries. I've watched people chase their tail trying to identify a problem, but they're going about it in the wrong way. And consequently, they end up coming up with the wrong solutions to their problem. And it can be so very correct. Daunting. And somebody like yourself
it is, makes and a if their background is working with a handful of different, if they've got 5 choices, then that's their experience, to work with those 5 different grades or types of metal. And they can solve that pretty easily. But those are the grades. It's the easy stuff. The vanilla grades, as we sometimes call them, that's what's going to low-cost countries.
Right.
The more challenging materials take a new set of fresh eyes, or expanding on the knowledge that people have. And that is one of the things that I enjoy is to show people how different grades, what makes them different, and how manufacturers should approach it differently.
Right. And I think it's very fulfilling when you get to help a manufacturer out and you see them come to that aha moment. It is incredible.
Yes. The light bulb comes, you can see the light bulb turning on, and then the real joy comes from when they're able to see that connection and then apply it to the next project that they have.
Right. Do you see a lot of
this?
And
it just becomes another part of the toolbox.
Yeah. And that's what you want them to do. You want them to just, it's very much like going to engineering school. When you get out, that doesn't mean that you can go and design aircraft.
Oh, goodness, no. No, it does not.
Yeah.
Let's hope not, at least.
Right. So talking about things like the challenges in like workforce development, how do you see that changing over the next 5 years? Because I think that's another one of those areas that, yes, training is important, but getting people interested also is a dire need that we have.
Absolutely. And I think that coming out of school, I mean, workforce development is, multifaceted, but just breaking it down into two components, those who are fresh out of school and those who are older in life and are being presented with opportunities to expand their horizons, either willingly or not so willingly.
Right.
Coming out of school, I think just a general exposure is the best the industry can realistically hope for. Yes, there's always going to be some people coming out of school who are just so gung-ho and want to absorb whatever they can. But coming out of school, I think most people don't have a wide enough perspective to understand the ramifications of what they're learning. They can learn about how the different grades behave from a book, but unless you deal with it on a day-to-day basis, you don't really appreciate the challenges that come from theory not matching reality.
Right.
Like, we might have a rule of thumb that we use in the industry at 10% cutting clearance, just as using that as a generic rule of thumb.
Right.
Well, okay, 10% is great. But what happens when you're a year into production? Does anybody actually measure the cutting clearance in production if they're having a cut edge problem? And is that cut edge uniform around the perimeter? You might learn one thing in school, but then the realities of a production environment make those targets not really feasible. So, inspiring students to learn coming out of school, making them, enhancing their natural curiosity, that's great. I think that if we can get that out of graduates, then the industry is going to be in really good shape. The other side of the coin, like I said, is the people who have worked in the industry for 10, 20 years, and now they're being faced with new challenges. Maybe they're given a new material to work with. Their company has said that, we've been forming low-carbon steel all these years. Now we're going to move into high-strength steels or sheet aluminum or stainless steels for other applications. The people on the floor know really well the products that they've worked with. But with these new products that have new characteristics, new features, new challenges, it's up to the management to do the appropriate training in a timely manner. Not say, start of production is in 2 months, and then throw the people who are on the floor who are responsible for making it work, tell them to, basically make it work without giving them the background as to what they need to change in their mindset.
Right.
So,
what do you?
I think most people. I was going to say most people on the floor, they want to do a good job. They want the tools to. Well, actually, it would be the tools to make their life easier. If they can design and build using the right parameters, things take a little bit more work up front. But when it's done right, production becomes a lot easier. And, as they say, when that big machine keeps going up and down, making that boom, boom, boom noise, that's when companies are making money.
Right. And do you see some of the newer technologies, when I say technologies, things like new sensor technologies, artificial intelligence, being able to sense and adjust things on the fly. Do you see those technologies and things like that are more available in lubrications now, and things that can make the parts perform better than we have in the past?
Artificial intelligence is only as good as the real intelligence that was that went into the programming.
Right.
There are a lot of great innovations that have come out, and I'll even throw in 3D printing. And the biggest companies can have the resources to implement it, but that doesn't mean that they have the brain power isn't the right word, but what are you going to do with all the data that's created? If you don't understand the data that you have now, then you're not going to really make the best use out of the massive capital expenditure needed for the artificial intelligence level. I mean, tonnage monitors, perfect example. If we actually were to use tonnage monitors, we'd be able to track just differences in forming load around the four corners of a part. And I've been into a bunch of shops that I ask, where's the tonnage monitor? Well, we have one, and it rotates between 5 or 6 presses, and we would use it in tryout, but right now it's broken sitting in the corner. If that's the state of your current tonnage monitor, then transitioning to artificial intelligence won't do you a whole lot of good.
Right. It's funny that you say that, because I've gone into plants that they say that they have tonnage monitors, and they have them on every machine. They're either turned off or they're reading zero. And
yep.
And we're talking high-end plants too. It's crazy.
Yes, we are. And that's I felt good. I was working with a company. We're a consulting firm, so we work with a bunch of different companies in different industries. Was asked the question about tonnage monitors and felt really good because this company was using tonnage monitors. And they sent me a screenshot of the part that they were making that they were having problems on. Well, it was something like 81 tons on one corner, 75 on another, 82 on another, and 320 on the fourth corner. Shockingly, the problem seemed to have been a lack of metal flow on one corner.
Right.
So in those cases, artificial intelligence will not help them. However, conversation did. A 5-minute conversation that hit the very basics of metal flow and draw beads, or in some cases lock beads. Having that conversation, the light bulb went off and problem was resolved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just those simple things sometimes can illuminate an underlying condition, and that's what I would call it, as an underlying condition of management, that they don't have their ducks in a row. And,
exactly.
And you're right. You can't make that next leap when you're you're chained to the past, is the way I look at it.
Correct. Yes.
What do you see as the major struggles for manufacturing over the next 5 years?
Adapting to new materials.
Yeah.
The rate at which new sheet metals are entering the market is much higher now than they were. And the new materials, I guess in the late 80s, 1990s, when, in the case of sheet steel, when a new grade became commercially available, it was an extension of prior grades. Maybe it was a little higher in strength. Maybe it had a little bit more ductility, but there was a natural transition in the strength elongation balance, as an example, that if you've worked in the industry, you can accommodate those changes. Well, now with grades coming out that don't have that traditional trade-off between higher strength always meaning much lower elongation, and some of the advanced grades may have the same strength and elongation, but they have other forming characteristics, like they have better bendability or edge ductility. Having that awareness at the shop floor level is going to be critical, I think, for production success.
Yeah, I can certainly see where some of these companies are really going to be challenged with that, because, as you mentioned earlier, it is they're so locked into what materials they've used in the past. They're not very open-minded to other materials, and they're going to have to be adapting. I would use
actually the term open-minded. I think the most of the materials decisions on which grade to use isn't within their discretion. I think their customers telling them what metal to use for at least some of the applications.
Right.
It isn't just use steel or use aluminum. It's use 7000 series aluminum or use a certain advanced high-strength steel. And the challenge that I've seen some members of the industry have is that those who are doing the quoting when, for example, in tool build and even in production, those who are doing the quoting say, well, this is just 10% higher in strength. So with that, I can quote my tool build as X number of weeks for this cost. But if they do that without understanding the nuances of the new metals that they're being faced with, they may wind up not quoting profitably anymore. And the more challenges, the more likely that they're not going to meet their targeted completion date. So shortcuts are taken.
Yeah.
And that doesn't do anybody any good in the industry.
No. And I think that's a challenge throughout a business. I think you're illustrating the point that it's not just one person who has to understand these new materials.
Oh, absolutely.
Throughout.
Yes. Yep. It's your quoting department. It's your purchasing department. Mm-hmm. If you're working in a metal stamper, you can't just say, give me the lowest cost grade. There are certain characteristics that are associated with those grades that, yes, the product may still sink in water, but it is sometimes more cost effective to buy a metal that's going to wind up costing more per pound, but you'll be able to stamp it with fewer defects, less downtime, and so on. So your out the door price will wind up being less, even though your purchasing department has to buy at a higher cost per pound. So again, with that, it may be management saying people, when it comes time for their annual performance review, one of the metrics of the purchasing department might have been historically lowest cost. Maybe that's not always the best decision. You want the lowest cost for the company, not just the lowest cost for your purchasing department.
Absolutely. and I think people have gotten in trouble with that over the past few years with offshoring tooling, where
Absolutely.
they didn't have a good hold on what the total cost of that was.
Exactly. Yes.
And
Yeah. Not only the total cost, but the total risk
yes,
associated with that.
Good point. Good point. What other things can you see coming down the road as far as technology goes that are going to be great opportunities for manufacturing and metal forming specifically?
Well, servo presses certainly bubbles up to the top of my mind. Just the flexibility that metal formers have. Buying a press is a absolutely very serious capital expenditure, and yes, there's an additional cost for a servo press, but by spending a little bit more up front, this 20, 30, or 40-year asset will be much more flexible to accommodate new materials that aren't even being dreamed of right now. Mm-hmm. And if you buy a new press now, that servo press will wind up lasting to 2050, or maybe even later in the in this century. And there are sheet metal, steel, and aluminum grades that are available now that weren't dreamed of 15 years ago. So if you don't have the right processing equipment to accommodate these new products, your asset that you just bought that you thought was going to last 30 years may not be appropriate for what's available.
Right.
Unless, again, you want to only stamp what metal grades were available 20 or 30 years ago, which are the non-value-added products at this point.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Danny, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be here. We really appreciate it. Want to thank our sponsors, the Precision Metal Forming Association and the PMA's Educational Foundation. To listen to this and other episodes of the podcast, you can go to longevityindustries.com and click on the podcast or any of your favorite podcast venues, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, radio, all of those. Please like and subscribe to the show. Danny, how can people reach you?
Well, you can go to my website, Quality Solutions website, that's qsgroup.com, or I write for PMA's Metal Forming Magazine. You can go to the metalformingmagazine.com website and look up the Science of Forming. I write the monthly Science of Forming column, and they have all of my contact information there.
Great.
And I also encourage people in terms of training. There's this great conference that Metal Forming Magazine is sponsoring in February of 2020 on lubrication technology. I'm going to be speaking there along with many people from the lubricant and metal forming industry.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to come on the podcast.
Thank you, Danny, and we'll be seeing you in February.
Fantastic.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Dean.